My name, my name is Balamohan Shingade. I'm a master's candidate in philosophy at the University of Auckland, where I've been working on a thesis titled Hermeneutical Injustice in the Context of Settler-Colonialism, parts of which I've attempted to put together as a short paper with you today. Now, I only wish I could be with you in person because it's the first time I'm presenting work outside of the context of my university. So nevertheless, I'm really thrilled to be joining virtually, and I'm looking forward really to learn from you all today. So I don't have slides. I just like to speak with you. I've got a bunch of examples, explanations, etc. And maybe what might help is if my screen is made big so that it really feels like I'm with you. So I want to begin by providing some context of settler colonialism, including a case study from Aotearoa that will orient us to what is at stake in our hermeneutical efforts across Indigenous settler groups and cultures. I contend that hermeneutical injustice plays a part in the maintenance of settler colonialism, which I think we ought to demystify for the prospects of just settler-Indigenous relations, as provided by the frameworks in Aotearoa by the founding documents He Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, so the Declaration of Independence and the Treaty of Waitangi. So I further demonstrate that cross-cultural knowledge practices are socio-politically motivated, such that the marginally situated make genuine efforts at interpretation and understanding, whereas dominantly situated interlocutors practice what I'm beginning to term disingenuous interpretative charity. And finally, I want to propose unsettling interpretations as a possible way forward. You know, the idea of unsettling, taking cue from settler. I take the example of Te Awa Tupua, Whanganui River Claims Settlement Act 2017. It's an act which granted legal personhood to the Whanganui River to suggest a way of overcoming hermeneutical injustice in the context of settler colonialism. Okay, so I want to start with a story of a dialogical interface between Te Ao Māori, the Māori world, Māori indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, and the Western worldview. In 2002, the New Zealand Transport Agency was required to halt work on a section of a highway development near a small town called Meremere, and it was due to the presence of a taniwha. In Te Ao Māori, taniwha are water spirits, taking many forms from logs to reptiles, whales, and often they live in lakes, rivers, or the sea. They're regarded as guardians by the people who live in their territories, but they may also have a malign influence on human beings. The road building was delayed while the transport agency and the local tribe, Ngāti Naho, entered deliberations, which actually ensued amicably. And although a resolution was really swiftly reached, news media took the tone and general commentary took the tone of mockery and ridicule. For example, the BBC ran a report with the headline, Māori Swamp Monster Delays Road. Now, this story illustrates that in Aotearoa New Zealand, practices of interpretation and understanding across Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview are asymmetrical. They take place against the backdrop of asymmetric relations of power across Indigenous and settler groups in the settler colonial context. Another example of incommensurable differences across Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview, which are also asymmetrical, is the conception of land. Now, we all know the destructive enterprise of the New Zealand Company and the British government, which enabled colonization here in our parts of the world, were based on the Western ideas of resource extraction, private property, and without which the acquisition of Indigenous territories could not have been pursued. For Māori, on the other hand, land is a source of identity based on whakapapa, meaning genealogy, a source of belonging and continuity shared between the dead, the living, and the unborn. When Indigenous peoples are required to frame their relationship to land through the concept of property, for example, this can stifle their ability to articulate that relation. thus amounting to a hermeneutical injustice. So in following this, it's my contention that epistemic and hermeneutical practices are not incidental to political struggles, but they're intrinsic to them. Or I phrase it differently, there is a search for justice at the interface of Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview. So this work joins the efforts of New Zealand settler scholars, I'm a settler here in Aotearoa, who are not immersed in Te Ao Māori, to find ways of relating justly to the fact of Indigenous difference. For those of us not immersed in Te Ao Māori, we often receive non-Western ideas as incongruous and uninterpretable within our present-day contexts. We receive them in cross-cultural dialogue and social interactions, in testimonial settings in the form of others as say-so, as speeches of resistance, perhaps in politics, as cultural narratives and retellings, as artistic works. Situated outside of Indigenous frameworks, I'm without, and we're without the inheritances and orientations to take up, let alone dwell in these other modes of thought, in non-Western manners of reasoning and relating. So this gap motivates my project. And herein, an account of hermeneutical injustice aims to bring to light the pitfalls and the blind spots in our hermeneutical efforts, which end up reproducing disrespect and discrimination of tangata whenua, or the people of the land, and Te Ao Māori, or the Māori world. Now, I want to move to the context of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is not a historical event. It's a perpetual system of power relations, resulting in the oppression of Indigenous peoples and cultures for the maintenance of the hegemonic West. In his seminal work, Settler Colonialism and the Transformation of Anthropology, the scholar, who's Australian, Patrick Wolfe, theorizes that underlying the perpetual system of settler colonialism is the logic of elimination. That's his phrase. Considering the role of settlement in colonization, Wolfe explains territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. Settler colonialism destroys to replace, end quote. In other words, this perpetual system of unequal power relations is based upon the erasure of the Indigenous. It does not merely exploit Indigenous peoples for labor and extract Indigenous lands for resources, as in the contexts of neo-colonialisms of the present day, but it actually seeks to displace the Indigenous through settlement. In the present-day context of Aotearoa New Zealand, the logic of elimination is perpetuated at the epistemic level, as the erasure of the Indigenous epistemic difference. That is, Indigenous ways of knowing and relating in the world. It includes the elimination of community voice and agency, and is perpetuated by the Eurocentrism of settlers, including settlers of color, such as myself perhaps, and sometimes also by Indigenous elites who assume the inevitable and quote unquote natural superiority of the hegemonic West. Settlers draw upon Eurocentric values of the West to legitimize ideas, justify narratives, uphold beliefs, and perpetuate the logic of elimination of Indigenous epistemic difference. Simultaneously, the miscognition and devaluing of Indigenous knowledge forms the basis of epistemic erasure. That is, through the delegitimation, distortion, disruption, displacement, disenfranchisement, etc., of kaupapa, which is protocols, tikanga, which is the first laws of our lands, mātauranga, the knowledge, te reo, the language, and te ao Māori, the Māori world, across the quote-unquote mainstream. The logic of elimination, however, is not the inevitable consequence of cross-cultural contact. Taking seriously non-Western knowledge claims is the prerequisite to overcoming the logic of elimination. But this is made deceptively difficult by the fact that collective, dominant understandings have been structured along the lines and the logics of the hegemonic West, which simultaneously distort and disrespect Indigenous epistemologies. It's here that I find that the concept of hermeneutical injustice is useful for analyzing Indigenous settler relations because it enables us to examine the epistemic dimension of social political injustices. I contend that hermeneutical injustice plays a part in the maintenance of settler colonialism and its underlying logic of elimination, which we ought to demystify for the prospects of decolonization. As we know, hermeneutical injustice is a type of epistemic injustice, since it is a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacities as a knower. And according to Miranda Fricker, hermeneutical injustice occurs, quote, when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences, end quote. However, in view of the critical literature that's been responding to Fricker's theory, I argue that we should understand the concept of hermeneutical injustice somewhat differently to Fricker. The recasting of hermeneutical injustice gives the concept greater explanatory power to diagnose efforts at interpretation and injustice across Te Ao Māori and the Western worldview in the context of Indigenous settler relations in Aotearoa New Zealand. Without rehearsing each and every departure, I want to say that we can motivate the departure from Fricker's definition of the concept of hermeneutical injustice by, for example, questioning the idea of collective resources, as the scholar Jose Medina has. Hello there, and my respects to you. Yeah, for interpretation and understanding. The notion that a gap within the shared hermeneutical resources gives rise to a form of epistemic injustice, as the scholar Rebecca Mason has, and that hermeneutical injustice deprives someone of self-understanding. Now, each of these can be problematized with the help of the broader critical literature on epistemic injustice in order to broaden the scope and applicability of the concept for the settler colonial context. And here is where I've got to with my recast definition of hermeneutical injustice for the settler colonial context, and it is as follows. Within the settler colonial context, hermeneutical injustice occurs due to deficiencies, dysfunctions, and distortions maintained in the dominant hermeneutical resources, which settlers in turn impose onto Indigenous peoples while simultaneously marginalizing them from shaping dominant interpretations and understandings in a way that draws upon Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. I can put that in the chat later. In light of this recast concept of hermeneutical injustice for the settler colonial context, the decolonial task can be seen more clearly, I think. That is, the active protection of Indigenous knowledge and assertion of its ways of knowing, and a reorientation to the same. For settlers, the decolonial task is to orient to solidarity with tangata whenua, people of the land, as they develop Indigenous ways of knowing as a counter-hegemonic movement to settler thought and activity which they find unjust or otherwise oppressive. I want to come now to this idea of the asymmetry in our epistemic and hermeneutical practices across Indigenous settler groups and cultures, which I find reinforces the effect of hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical and epistemic practices are asymmetrically motivated in the settler colonial context, such that Indigenous people will generally have, as a group entity, firstly, a fluency with Western frameworks as compared with settlers who will not in the same way be engaged in Indigenous frameworks. And secondly, veridical perceptions of social reality in contrast to their settler interlocutors. I want to clear an ambiguity. Am I discussing Indigenous peoples and settler groups' engagement with each other's culturally specific epistemologies? Or am I discussing veridical perceptions of social realities? Insofar as the asymmetry is concerned, I think both. Take the example of the persistent racist belief that the disproportionate representation of Māori, quote, at every stage of our criminal justice system, both as offenders and as victims, end quote, is caused by a supposed culture of violence among Māori. Books and films such as Alan Duff's Once Were Warriors manifest the stereotype and have been hugely successful both in New Zealand and internationally, perpetuating a deficit view of Māori. And as recently as 2006, mainstream news media platforms reported that so-called research linked a gene with aggressive behavior, specifically in Māori. Now, this is an example of the kind of motivated ignorances at play amongst settlers. It is a type of structural group-based cognitive dysfunction wherein settlers are unwilling to unmask settler crime in order to understand the ways in which their society is structured by the oppression of Indigenous peoples for the benefit of settlers. Simultaneously, the injustices experienced by Māori are rendered totally unintelligible. Recalling the work of the late Charles W. Mills's Epistemology of Ignorance, it is my contention that genuine interpretation occurs only in one direction across such a stark power dynamic. By virtue of their social position, marginally situated Indigenous peoples have to exercise interpretative charity in a way that the powerful settler interlocutors do not. So Indigenous peoples have to exercise interpretive charity to make sense of their own experience in a world that is structured along the lines and the logic of the hegemonic West. There is a greater burden placed upon Māori to construct new realities for their very survival, but the same is not true in the other direction. In this way, we can see that the exercising of interpretation in a sincere or charitable way is not innocent or accidental, but it is socially motivated and incentivized. The onus usually falls on colonized people to make their claims intelligible to settlers in languages acceptable to them, rather than the onus falling on settlers to justly interpret Indigenous interlocutors. And when settlers do engage in the interpretation of Indigenous knowledges, it often follows a pattern that I'm wanting to term disingenuous interpretive charity. I argue that hermeneutical injustice is reinforced by settlers' practice of disingenuous interpretive charity, which prevents Indigenous knowers from shaping dominant understanding. At the same time, Indigenous knowledge is assimilated or co-opted into hegemonic frameworks of the dominant group. I want to offer three clarifications for what I mean by disingenuous interpretive charity. These are rough, I'm working on them, and I'd love your insights on this. Then I want to use an example at the interface of scientific explanation and Indigenous knowledge to demonstrate its functioning. The consequence of disingenuous interpretive charity are many faulty things, all of which are aimed at the elimination of Indigenous epistemic difference. For example, surface accommodation, tokenism, lip service, appropriation, extraction, co-option, instrumentalism, chic radicalism, and so on. In other words, I argue that the logic of elimination theorized by Patrick Wolfe as underlying the settler colonial situation is exercised at the hermeneutical level through settlers' disingenuous interpretive charity. Firstly, to be disingenuous means to be lacking in the basic requirements of trust that is necessary for rightful interpretation and understandings across interlocutors. The central issue here is that settlers are untrustworthy hearers if we are not vulnerable, really and radically vulnerable in our sense-making, with the possibility of destructuring our existing frameworks. Secondly, disingenuous interpretive charity is not the same as disinterpretation. Disinterpretation is to narratives what disinformation is to facts. In other words, disinterpretation is the deliberate misinterpretation of narrative with exploitative and antisocial intentions. The intention to deceive is straightforwardly immoral, even if it is not always easy to pinpoint. But our account of hermeneutical injustice is less concerned by bad faith interpretations and more concerned by the circulation of systemic and structural mishearing, misinterpretation, and malinterpretations. My use of the word disingenuous intends to capture non-deliberate practices that perpetuate structural injustices. And I prefer it over insincere in order to point to the subtle structural nature of what might be going on that is duplicitous or dishonest. Now, although it makes little sense to say that a structure is disingenuous or that it has disingenuous intentions, people's disingenuity plays into asymmetrical relations of power. What is deliberate about disingenuous interpretive charity is not the intention to deceive, but rather the intention to maintain the status quo. Because all the right markers of charitable interpretation may be there, they may be outwardly present, but the understandings that are produced do not intend to destructure or question the status quo of the hegemonic West. And thirdly, disingenuity is knowledge as regulation. It's the regulation of beliefs so as to uphold the status quo of Western hegemonic frameworks. Through a number of interpretive tricks and hermeneutical burlesque, Indigenous knowledge claims are folded back into hegemonic settler discourse. In hearing the claims of Indigenous knowers, the practice of disingenuity finds confirmation of that knowledge claim in the world of already held beliefs and ontological epistemic orientations. In other words, a recourse to Western frameworks is often taken to recognize Indigenous knowledge as knowledge and a way to prove validity. Through the process of disingenuous interpretive charity, although the inquirer arrives at a sympathetic understanding of the knowledge claim, as in, I get it, it's not a genuine understanding because the Western hegemonic frameworks prevent Indigenous knowledge from touching upon and actually shaping understandings that are in play in the dominant frameworks. So what does this look like? In the settler colonial context, here in Aotearoa New Zealand, it's an instance where Mātauranga Māori, which is Māori knowledge, is taken up by non-Māori hearers and adopted with the outward markers of understanding. And actually, it's adopted with the aim to modify settler practices, not for decolonial ends, but for the sake of perpetuating existing asymmetrical relations of power. Imagine a museum director, right, making a last-minute phone call to a respected Māori elder with a petition to open an important event with a blessing. There is something disingenuous going on in the director's claim that a ceremony at formal occasions fulfills an institution's obligations to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our founding document of partnership. And I'm not making this example up, I'm borrowing it from comments made by the director of Auckland Art Gallery, Toyo Tamaki. As Māori scientist Ocean Rebecca Mercier writes, Mātauranga Māori, Māori knowledge, is seen to have economic benefits to the colony and is thus subsumed within current colonial capitalist practices, end quote. It seems to me that if this dial a blessing phenomenon is indeed dysfunctional and disrespectful at the social political level, then it is because of disingenuity at the hermeneutical level. An Indigenous practice is adopted and adhered to, when the museum calls for the Māori elder to open with ceremony, but actually the gesture fails completely to reflect an attitude of openness and partnership and solidarity with Indigenous peoples and cultures. And I think this is important to point out since it plays a key role in how power is maintained and how hegemony plays out in the settler colonial context. It kind of continues the agenda of the status quo and seeks to adopt Māori knowledge to the epistemic standards of the Western hegemony. I want to take another example, perhaps slightly more contentious, perhaps slightly subtler, but it's something I find fascinating, which is the uptake of Taniwha narratives. Now, I explain Taniwha as the water spirits. So the uptake of Taniwha narratives by those not immersed in the Māori world through a recourse to scientific explanation. Now, at the outset, remembering feminist epistemologies, I want to note the plurality of sciences, right? And to be sure, my argument is in no way anti-science. After all, understanding non-scientific hegemonic knowledge does not entail discarding scientific explanations. Rather, what I'm referring to is the monopolistic project, which mortgages the notions of truth and validity and so on to a scientific explanation undergirded by the political economy of global colonial capitalism. The form of science that claims, as Boaventura de Souza Santos writes, quote, an absence of prejudice, the prejudice of pretending to have no prejudices. Linda Tuhiwai Smith, Māori decolonial scholar here, also frames such a concern in her seminal work, Decolonizing Methodologies, where she writes how Western science is deeply implicated in our parts of the world with the colonial project, to the detriment of Indigenous peoples and knowledges. But of course, there can be a counter-hegemonic science grounded in Indigenous epistemologies and concerns that can be foregrounded, and that can be found actually here through Māori scientists' work like Dan Hikuroa, Ranginui Mātamua, Ocean Rebecca Mercier, and many others. So there's a difference. My concern with the settlers' adoption of Māori knowledge is the way the process upholds hegemonic settler discourse in the name of scientific explanations. The disingenuous uptake of taniwha narratives by those not immersed in the Māori world presumes that the scientist will find confirmation in Indigenous knowledge what is true in the already held beliefs and methods of Western science. That the knowledge claims in Indigenous narratives may simply be cruder expressions of scientific truths. In other words, from the disingenuous settler interlocutor's point of view, retellings of taniwha narratives can only be recognized as knowledge practices to the extent that they are the mirror image of scientific hegemonic knowledge. Why call this disingenuous interpretive charity? Because I think it's disingenuous insofar as that taniwha narratives becomes reframed as knowledge that is knowable from Western epistemologies. It decontextualizes Indigenous understandings and reinscribes Māori knowledge into the hegemonic discourses of the West, inevitably distorting Māori knowledge and wronging Māori specifically in their capacities as knowers and knowledge holders. Okay, I'm seeing that I'm running out of time. So what I want to do is quickly jump to this idea that I want to propose, which is a path towards what cross-cultural hermeneutical and epistemic dialogical exchanges look like that do not mortgage knowledges to colonial terms of reference, which necessarily render knowledges primitive or barbaric. And here I want to take the example, maybe just introduce it here, of a 2017 governmental act, which is the Te Awa Tupua, Whanganui River Claims Settlement Act, which was passed as part of a treaty settlement process. The act records, among other things, acknowledgements and apology given by the Crown to Whanganui Iwi, the tribe here, and records the historical claims of Whanganui River as those relate to the tribe. So the resulting Indigenous settler co-governance agreement that was instituted is on the basis of the river being declared to be a legal person, having all the rights, power, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. The tribe who trace their ancestral lineage to the river recognize the act as a means to reconcile Te Ao Māori conceptualizations of the river as ancestor with the Western common law. Now, the important point of connection for our account of hermeneutical possible justice is that the act gives an example of how hegemonic frameworks become unsettled through the intervention of Indigenous knowledge. What was hitherto a natural resource for management in the dominant settler colonial frameworks is destructured so as to place Māori ways of knowing, being, and interacting with more than human entities as common dominant understanding. The river adopts agency that it always already had according to Māori knowledge, and is given equal status to human and corporate persons. This registers a counter-hegemonic potential to the context of colonial capitalist resource extraction practices. In other words, the decolonial potential of an example such as Te Awa Tupua is the disruption and destabilization of the privileging of Western ontologies and epistemologies, and allowing space for different ways of thinking and being. So the example, I'm hoping, is exciting insofar as it gives hope to the project of decolonization in Aotearoa New Zealand. It's by no means a perfect example, and I had prepared to go into how it was not perfect. But I think what's interesting for our part as settlers is our willingness to unsettle hegemonic frameworks of interpretation and understanding in order to attend to the needs of the hermeneutically marginalized. Unsettling is a necessary part of the search for justice. So what future configurations will look like, we cannot know or predict. But I'm interested in what might epistemic and hermeneutical justice look like in the context of this work of decolonization that is almost suggested by Te Awa Tupua, or this 2017 governmental act. Thank you so much for listening. I'll pause here and really appreciate your attention.